Today, I'm going to be talking to you about autism spectrum disorder and how it impacts the way we interact with our social world. So autism spectrum disorder is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and it impacts approximately 1 in 59 children. It is characterized by deficits in social motivation and theory of mind. What that means for social motivation is that they lack a strong social motivation to be like others. And for theory of mind, they are unable to attend to and learn from socially relevant information. So what exactly is theory of mind? It's technically our ability to read each other's minds. It's our capacity to reason about the mental states of other people. In children with ASD and individuals who are adults with ASD, this ability is often impaired. The social motivation theory of ASD suggests that children who go on to develop ASD later in life show early deficits in social motivation, which prevents them from attending to socially relevant information in their environment. This deficit is proposed to explain the sociocognitive deficits associated with ASD, including theory of mind deficits. So how do we measure theory of mind? One of the ways we do this is through a false belief task. So you can see here there are two dolls, Sally and Anne. Sally has a marble, and she places it in her box. When Sally goes for a walk, Anne takes the marble and places it in her box. When Sally returns, she wants to play with her marble. Where will she look for it? So, if you have theory of mind, you can recognize that beliefs can sometimes be false. And so you would recognize that Sally would look for her marble in the place she last left it. If you lack theory of mind, you're unable to distinguish your knowledge from Sally's knowledge, and you might indicate that she would look for the marble in the place where it actually is, rather than in the place where she last left it. Another false belief task that we can implement is comparing implicit versus explicit responses. Results suggest that implicit and explicit theory of mind and false belief are two separate processes, and that implicit false belief tasks and theory of mind appear to be impaired in ASD throughout adulthood. So the way we measure implicit theory of mind, we look at the way children anticipate behavior, where their eyes are looking, where they expect Sally to look for her marble. But if we're measuring explicit measures, we need them to either verbally or physically indicate where they believe the marble will be, or where they believe Sally will look for the marble. Another false belief task is the Smarties task, but there's a potential confound. Children are asked what is in here, and so they rely on their statement as to what they think is in this Smarties box. It is then revealed that there is a pencil inside the Smarties box. Children are then asked, before you looked inside the box, what did you think was inside? Children may be relying on their previous statement, responding to the question, what's in here, as opposed to their representational theory of mind. The other person test question asks, later I'm going to show this box to your teacher. She hasn't seen what's inside though. What will she think is in there before she looks inside? The final question is a reality control question, asking what is inside the box really. So the adaptation of this task is the plasters task. In this task, children were shown a box of bandages, and their teacher said, "Oh, I have a little cut on my finger. Can you please get me a bandage?" And when children reach inside the box, they find that there are birthday candles inside as opposed to bandages. For the self-test question, they are asked, before you looked inside the box, what did you think was inside? For this task, their answer must reflect an awareness of one's own prior belief as opposed to their prior statement. The rest of the questions are the same as the Smarties task, asking, later I'm going to show this box to your teacher. She hasn't seen what's inside it though. What do you think she will think is inside? And finally, the reality control question. What is inside the box really? Another thing we test for in children with ASD is social motivation, and the way we measure this is through different tasks. There is a face preference task and a biological motion preference task. Children who are typically developing tend to prefer a face versus a linear expression of shapes. They also tend to prefer biological motion over random motion. Children with ASD don't tend to show these preferences. A fun fact, it's not always a bad thing to not be socially motivated. Children with ASD tend to be less susceptible to social pressures, like peer pressure. The final thing that we'd like to test for is moral judgment. In children with ASD, moral judgment is often impaired or slightly delayed in its development. The way we test for this is we tell children a story. First, they learn about Jenny. Jenny wants to play with scissors when her mom is gone. As soon as she plays with the scissors, she cuts a little hole in her dress. Then we learn about Lucy. Lucy wants to please her mother with a little present. She decides to cut some flowers from a colored paper sheet and give them to her mom. While she's doing her job, she cuts a big hole in her dress. So, then we ask children, who is naughtier and why? If children say that Jenny is naughtier, they're in the autonomous stage of moral judgment, meaning that they focus more on intentions rather than consequences. If they say that Lucy is naughtier, they're in the heteronomous stage of moral judgment, meaning that they focus more on rules and consequences. Children with ASD are usually in the heteronomous stage and tend not to pass that stage as early as typically developing children. An important question to ask, though, is would the findings be different in this experiment if we used an ecological or real-life setting, either using Confederates who were acting, or if we put children in an experiment where they were playing with other children and those children made a mistake, and we compared that real-life experience to a potential story. The summary of findings up until now are that previous experiments have demonstrated that children with ASD tend to perform worse than typically developing children on theory of mind, social motivation, and moral judgment tasks. The main aims of my study are firstly to determine whether there is a predictive relationship between social motivation, theory of mind, and moral judgment, to compare the results obtained from variations in the false belief task, and lastly, to compare moral judgment measures in both fictional and ecological settings. My hypothesis is that in both typically developing and ASD children, better scores on social orienting in early childhood will be predictive of and positively correlated with better scores on theory of mind and moral judgment tests later in development. My experiment would be a longitudinal design starting at age 4 and being repeated at age 7 and 10. It would include 25 ASD children and 25 typically developing children. I would measure social motivation using the face preference task and the biological motion preference task. I would measure false belief or theory of mind using the explicit and implicit measures and both the Smarties and the adapted plasters task. Finally, I would test moral judgment using both a fictional setting and an ecological setting. My proposed results are that across development, ASD children will perform worse than typically developing children on theory of mind, social orienting, and moral judgment tasks. In both ASD and typically developing children, I predict that low scores on social orienting tasks early in development will be predictive of lower scores in social orienting, theory of mind, moral judgment tasks later in development. There are several implications my study would have. Firstly, by better understanding the interaction between theory of mind, social orientation, and moral judgment across development in ASD and typically developing children, early intervention practices can become more specialized, either focusing solely on social orienting, moral judgment, or theory of mind. Secondly, examining the developmental trajectory of the deficits associated with ASD allows us to better understand how genetics interact with lived experiences in your environment. Finally, future studies should examine the effectiveness of early intervention and developmental changes in social motivation, theory of mind, and the moral judgment of children with ASD. Thank you so much for watching. Here are my references. My name is Nada Morthy, and this has been my final project for Psych 413.